ID and boarding pass. Now. The command struck the air like a slap. Officer Ethan Hayes planted himself directly in front of Olivia Grant, his tone sharp, his posture rigid, his eyes narrowed with an authority he hadn't yet earned. Travelers nearby froze for a moment. Startled by the force behind his voice, Olivia felt every head turn in her direction, the weight of public judgment settling on her shoulders before she even understood what he thought she had done. Ethan's hand hovered near his holster, not touching it, but close enough to send a clear message in that first instant. The line between a routine check and an unnecessary escalation vanished, and Olivia understood that whatever came next would not be simple. The rookie officer wasn't just questioning her, he was challenging her right to stand where she stood, in the quiet exclusivity of the VIP boarding lane, beneath the bright afternoon lights of O'Hare's Terminal 3. Before we go into this story, where you're watching from, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and give me a like. It helps a lot, and it lets me know you want more stories just like this one. Olivia steadied her breath, knowing the moment felt wrong in a way she had learned to recognize years ago. The concourse buzzed around her, waves of rolling suitcases and murmured conversations drifting in every direction. Yet at the center of it, everything felt unnaturally still. She had just wrapped 3 exhausting days at a civil rights conference in Washington, and the strain of travel sat heavy behind her eyes. Even so, she held her posture, shoulders squared inside her tailored navy suit, professional, composed, and patient. Ethan, meanwhile, paced with restless energy, trying to project confidence while fighting his own inexperience. He was 26, 8 months into the job, and every step he took showed the influence of a father he idolized and barely understood. To him, authority meant never hesitating. To Olivia, it meant knowing when not to push. "I already scanned in with the attendant," Olivia said, keeping her voice even. "Why are you stopping me?" Ethan didn't answer at first. Instead, he studied her with a look she had seen before in other places, from other people. A look that searched for something wrong, something suspicious, something that explained why a woman who looked like her would be standing in a line usually reserved for executives, diplomats, and wealthy travelers. He drew in a slow breath, as if bracing himself. "Ma'am, I need to see your ID and boarding pass. Step aside." She didn't move. On what basis? That single question irritated him, more than she expected. His jaw tightened. Security screening, random selection. Olivia's eyes didn't leave his. "I know the TSA procedures. This isn't one of them. You're a CPD officer, not TSA. You need reasonable suspicion to detain me." Her calm only deepened his agitation. Passengers had begun to watch. Some leaned in, some lifted phones. Not recording yet, but close. Ethan felt the pressure on his back like heat. He had to maintain control. He had to prove he could handle a simple stop, and somewhere beneath that, something more dangerous stirred. A belief, absorbed over years, that people like her were more likely to be trouble than truth. "Step aside now," he repeated. She stepped aside, but deliberately, not timidly. He seized the opportunity and reached for her bag. "Sir, that is unlawful," she said. But he was already unzipping it with movements that were too quick and too careless. Inside, beneath a folder of travel documents, he found it. A thick DOJ-marked report stamped internal use only. A briefing on patterns of misconduct within multiple police departments nationwide. A report she was carrying back to Washington under routine authorization. Ethan snatched it up like contraband, his chest rising as though he had cracked open a federal conspiracy. "What's this?" he demanded. "Classified information? You transporting this without clearance?" Olivia's voice was steady. "That belongs to the Department of Justice. Put it back." You leaking this? Ethan snapped. You sharing internal documents at the airport? The accusation was so irrational that Olivia almost laughed. But this wasn't a moment for laughter. Officer Hayes, she said quietly, you are making a mistake. Backup arrived before she could say more. 2 officers moved in behind him, hands hovering near their belts, eyes already framing her as a problem to be contained. Passengers began lifting phones now, several at once. Among them was Marcus Reed, a freelance journalist who sensed a story before he even knew the details. He held his phone high, adjusting angles, capturing every second with a steady hand. Ethan gestured sharply. Turn around, hands behind your back. Olivia felt her breath catch for the first time. You have no grounds to detain me. Search and seizure without cause is a violation of the 4th Amendment. He ignored her. The cuffs clicked hard around her wrists, too tight, digging into skin she instinctively tried to protect. When he yanked her arms upward, the metal cut through, leaving a sudden sting. A thin line of blood slid down her wrist. She winced, but she didn't cry out. Marcus captured the moment, the force, the shock in her eyes, the crowd's reaction, and the footage would soon echo across the country. I'm a DOJ attorney, she said, her voice almost a whisper, not from fear, but from disbelief. You are violating the law. Ethan hesitated, only for a breath. But he didn't stop. He had gone too far, and the only path he saw now was forward. The officers escorted her away from the boarding area, past rows of stunned travelers and blinking flight monitors. Olivia missed her flight before she even reached the security office. She would sit, handcuffed, in a small metal chair for the next 2 hours, her wrist bleeding, her patience tested, her dignity frayed, but she would not sit idle. When they finally left her alone for a moment, she found a pen, steadied her trembling hand, and began writing. Every detail, every quote, every expression, every violation. A lifetime of knowing better collided with a moment she could no longer ignore. She would not leave O'Hare quietly. She would leave it with a mission and a promise. You just searched a federal prosecutor. Olivia's words struck the room with a force that stopped every movement cold. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply lifted her DOJ credentials with her injured wrist, the badge catching the fluorescent light of the holding area. The moment Ethan Hayes saw it, his entire expression changed. The bravado drained from his face, replaced by something he had not felt in the past 8 months on the job. Fear. Real fear. The kind that sinks deep. The kind that tells a person they have just crossed a line they can never step back over. The other officers shifted uneasily, glancing at one another, silently asking who had misjudged the situation and how far the damage would reach. Supervisor Ramirez, summoned by airport staff after hearing reports of an escalating conflict, entered the room just as Olivia placed the badge on the metal table. He stopped mid-step, eyes widening slightly at the sight of the emblem he knew too well. Suddenly, the chain of authority in the room didn't flow through uniform or rank. It flowed through truth, and everyone could feel it tightening. Before Ramirez could speak, Olivia did. I need all body cam footage preserved, she said, her voice calm but firm. Every second, from every angle. And I want the names of everyone who was part of this detention. She wasn't shouting. She didn't need to. Her tone carried the weight of 20 years prosecuting misconduct cases. She knew the law, and she knew the fear it brought to those who pretended to understand it. Ramirez nodded immediately. Understood, he said, stepping closer, already sensing the mess he had inherited. He looked at Ethan, who stood frozen, the color draining slowly from his cheeks. Officer Hayes, Ramirez said quietly, turn your body cam over to me. Now. Ethan hesitated, but only for a moment. His hands trembled as he unclipped the device. The room felt smaller now, tighter, as if the walls themselves recognized the shift in power. Olivia let her gaze settle on Ethan's face, not with anger, but with clarity. She wanted him to understand exactly what he had done. She wanted him to hear his own choices echo back at him in a room where silence seemed loud enough to break. Ramirez escorted the other officers out, leaving Ethan alone with her for a brief moment. The air between them felt heavy. "I didn't know." He whispered, "You didn't look." He stopped himself, but the damage was already in the air. Olivia heard the sentence he didn't finish. It landed deeper than any accusation he had made earlier. She spoke without lifting her voice. "I didn't look like I belonged." "Say it." Ethan swallowed, eyes fixed on the floor. He couldn't. Not out loud. But she didn't need him to. The truth was already there, floating between them, sharper than anything he had found in her bag. As Ramirez returned with paperwork and a quiet apology, Olivia sat back in her chair, letting the cold metal steady her spinning thoughts. She was free now, no longer under detention. But the emotional residue clung to her like dust. She had spent her career fighting for people who endured what she had just experienced, but living it again, even after all these years, dug into places she thought she had already healed. Memories stirred that she did not want to revisit. The Chicago of her childhood, the stores she had been followed in, the teachers who insisted she had cheated when she excelled, the neighbors who moved away when her family moved in. Moments she buried, moments she rarely let herself revisit, but moments that shaped the steel in her voice. She closed her eyes only long enough to steady the ache behind them. Ramirez cleared his throat gently. "Miss Grant, you are released, and transportation has been arranged back to the terminal." His tone held respect and guilt, and a quiet gratitude that she had not demanded his badge as well. Olivia nodded, then rose slowly, her wrist throbbing from the tightness of the cuffs. Ramirez noticed the wound and whispered to the nearest officer, who rushed off for a medical kit, but Olivia held up her hand. "Leave it. I will have it documented properly." She wanted the evidence intact, untouched. She had learned long ago that pain, when preserved correctly, could become truth in a courtroom. The moment she stepped back into the terminal's bright corridor, the world felt louder, busier, more chaotic. The hum of travelers, the rolling of suitcases, the overhead announcements, all of it washed over her in a tide of motion she was not yet ready for. But she walked forward anyway, pulling her phone from her pocket with her uninjured hand. She called one person, Laura Chen, her closest friend from college and now one of the sharpest private attorneys in Chicago. When Laura answered, Olivia didn't try to sound calm. "I need you," she said softly. And Laura, without asking what had happened, replied, "Where are you?" "I'm coming," while Olivia waited for her. She stood near a large window overlooking the tarmac. Planes taxied by in long, deliberate arcs, indifferent to the chaos inside the building. She let the slow movement settle her heartbeat. But the peace didn't last long. Her phone buzzed with a message from Marcus Reed, the journalist who had filmed everything. He sent a short note. "I have the footage. It's powerful. And it's the truth." She opened the link he attached. In seconds, she watched the scene she had just lived. Ethan's barked commands, the unjustified search, the tightening of the cuffs, the strain in her voice when she protested. Seeing it from the outside was worse than experiencing it from within. The video captured everything she feared the world would never see, and it was already spreading. By evening, the clip had swept through every platform, captioned simply, "O'Hare Incident." At first, she didn't think much of it. Viral moments came and went, but within an hour, thousands of comments appeared, Within 2 hours, protests formed outside O'Hare. Within 3, legal scholars, civil rights advocates, and former DOJ officials began dissecting the recording frame by frame. The country did not know her name yet, but they would, back at home. Ethan watched the same video on his living room couch, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Sarah, his wife, stood behind him, arms folded, her face pale with confusion and anger. "What were you thinking?" she demanded. He tried to explain himself, but the words came out broken, scattered, meaningless. Every excuse he offered sounded hollow even to him. He rewound the video again and again, watching Olivia's calm face, watching his own aggression, watching the moment he crossed the line. For the first time, he saw himself the way the world did, and he didn't recognize the person on the screen. That night, Olivia filed formal complaints with the DOJ and Chicago Internal Affairs. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize. She simply documented the truth. The truth was enough. Ethan was placed on immediate suspension pending investigation, and Sarah sat awake long into the night, staring at the man she married, wondering if she truly knew him at all. In the quiet of her apartment, Olivia placed her journal on the table, opened it to a fresh page, and began writing again, not to heal, not yet, but to remember, because she knew that memory, when preserved carefully, could become justice, and justice was coming. Rookie cuffs DOJ lawyer. The headline exploded across every major platform before sunrise, carried on the voice of a nation that had not yet learned Olivia Grant's name, but already felt the sting of what she endured. It echoed through morning radio, scrolled across cable news tickers, and spread through millions of phones still lying beside pillows. By the time Olivia opened her eyes the next morning, the world had already taken sides. O'Hare International Airport had become the center of a storm she did not ask for, but one she refused to ignore. The video filmed by Marcus Reed had reached more than 10 million views overnight, each share carrying a piece of truth that no one could dismiss. The clip showed her restraint, Ethan's aggression, the unjustified search, and the moment her wrist bled beneath the metal cuffs. It was only 38 seconds long, but it carried decades of history in every frame. It stirred anger, disbelief, and grief in people who had lived through similar moments. It sparked conversations in homes, offices, classrooms, and city halls, and it pushed Chicago's police department into a corner where silence was no longer possible. Chicago PD opened its formal investigation within hours. The department issued a brief statement about reviewing procedures, but the public knew what those phrases meant. They sensed hesitation. They sensed fear. Groups gathered outside O'Hare Terminal 3, holding signs, speaking into cameras, demanding accountability. Some had traveled from across the city, some from neighborhoods that had long stopped believing anyone cared. The crowd's presence was not violent. It was weary, angry, determined. They had seen this pattern before, but this time, they had a name, a face, and a piece of undeniable evidence inside her apartment. Olivia sat at the kitchen table with a cup of cooling coffee beside her. She had not slept more than 2 hours. Her wrist throbbed where the metal had cut into her skin, but she ignored the pain. She had work to do. Laura Chen sat across from her, papers spread out between them, her expression focused and protective. Laura had seen clients hurt before, but watching the video had shaken her in a way she didn't admit aloud. "You didn't escalate," she said quietly. "You didn't resist. He had no probable cause." Olivia nodded, flipping through her notes, her journal, her documents. She had handled federal cases involving police misconduct for 20 years, but being the victim herself stirred emotions she didn't want to unpack. Not yet. Instead, she leaned into her discipline, She organized timelines. She saved every file. She cataloged every message and every recorded angle of the incident. She prepared as if she were building a case for someone else, someone she cared about deeply but refused to pity. Marcus Reed arrived later that afternoon, tired but steady. He had spent the morning giving interviews he hadn't planned on, answering questions he didn't feel trained to handle. Yet he showed up at Olivia's door with quiet respect. "I only caught what I saw," he said, "but I'm here if you need me." His footage had become the backbone of the emerging case, and he understood the weight of that responsibility. Olivia thanked him and promised transparency. She would not use his video for theatrics. She would use it for truth. And truth, she believed, was enough. Across the city, Ethan Hayes sat in his dimly lit living room, staring at the same footage for what felt like the 100th time. He had not left the couch. His uniform hung over a chair, untouched. His badge lay on the shelf where he dropped it earlier that morning after Internal Affairs notified him of his suspension. Sarah stood at the far end of the room, arms crossed, her face pale and exhausted. When Ethan tried to speak, she stepped farther away. "I don't know who you were in that video," she said softly, her voice breaking. "I don't know what you were trying to prove." Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't. When he heard his own voice in the recording, sharp and rushed, he felt sick. When he saw the fear and disbelief in Olivia's eyes, he felt something deeper, shame pressing against the edges of denial. He had grown up hearing stories from his father about keeping control, about not letting anyone challenge your authority, about maintaining presence. But all of that sounded hollow now. None of it justified what he had done. None of it aligned with the oath he swore. He couldn't blame the badge. He couldn't blame the training. He had made his own decisions, and the consequences were unfolding faster than he could process. As the weeks passed, the Chicago PD investigation intensified. Supervisors dug into body cam footage. They reviewed Ethan's record. They interviewed colleagues. They cross-checked every decision he made that afternoon. And slowly, pieces of a larger truth emerged. A former colleague of Ethan's, Officer Dalton, stepped forward with a quiet confession. Ethan had a pattern, not of overt violence, but of selecting certain passengers for additional questioning. Mostly minorities, mostly young men, mostly people who didn't match his idea of who belonged in a VIP line or a quiet terminal corner. Dalton admitted he had looked the other way. He's new. He had told himself, he'll grow out of it. But growth never came. And now, the aftermath of that leniency had become a national spectacle. When Olivia heard Dalton's testimony summarized in a preliminary report, she set her pen down for a long moment. She didn't want to feel vindicated. She didn't want to feel victorious. She wanted accountability. She wanted improvement. She wanted to believe Ethan could have changed before hurting anyone else. But change, she knew, often required pain, and not everyone survived that process intact. With the investigation underway, Olivia and Laura began preparing for the civil rights lawsuit. They relied heavily on Olivia's journal, pages filled with raw reflections, frustrations, and memories of her early years in Chicago's underserved neighborhoods. The entries weren't polished. They weren't written for the public. But they carried the emotional truth that legal documents often could not. Laura believed they would matter in court. They revealed the lifelong toll of systemic bias. They explained why Olivia stood firm that day, even when handcuffs tightened around her wrists. They added depth to a case that was already strong, in fact. By the end of the 4th week, the Chicago Police Department announced its decision. Ethan Hayes was terminated from the force. The announcement was brief, delivered at a press conference filled with carefully chosen language, but the message was clear. He had crossed a line that even the department could not defend. When Olivia read the statement, she didn't smile. Instead, She closed her journal and looked out the window at the fading evening light. She knew this was only the beginning. A lawsuit under Title 42 of the United States Code. Section 1983 would follow. A trial, evidence, witnesses, cross-examinations. She would face Ethan again, not on an airport floor, but in a federal courtroom. She did not relish the idea, but she accepted it with steady resolve. Across the city. Ethan sat alone in his car in a quiet parking lot, gripping the steering wheel with trembling hands. He wasn't angry. He wasn't defensive. He was scared, and for the first time since childhood, he allowed himself to admit that he needed help. The storm had begun, and every life touched by it was about to change. The lawsuit arrived like a thunderclap. A thick envelope slid into Ethan Hayes' mailbox on a quiet Tuesday morning, its return address bearing the unmistakable seal of the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Illinois. He stood at the curb for a long moment, staring at the envelope as though it might burn his hands. When he finally tore it open, the words inside hit him with the force of a falling beam. Civil action. $15 million. His knees weakened. He gripped the metal mailbox to steady himself. 15 million. It wasn't just a number. It was a verdict before the verdict. It was a declaration that his single decision at O'Hare had not only changed Olivia Grant's life, but had now shattered his own. Sarah watched him from the porch, her arms folded tightly across her chest, her expression drained of sympathy. She had warned him days before that she wasn't sure she could hold their family together. And now, seeing the papers tremble in his hands, she stepped back into the house, not out of cruelty, but out of exhaustion. She had no strength left to fight a battle she didn't choose. Across the city, Olivia sat at her dining table with Laura Chen. The evidence spread neatly before them. Olivia had spent weeks gathering every thread, every photograph, every witness statement, and every entry from her journal that revealed the depth of her lifelong experience with bias. She didn't approach the lawsuit with vengeance. She approached it with purpose. Her aim wasn't to ruin a life. It was to expose a pattern, a system, a belief that authority could be misused without consequence. She flipped through Marcus Reed's footage frame by frame, not to relive the pain, but to understand exactly what the public had seen. In her journal, she had written that the hardest part of justice wasn't the confrontation. It was the courage to follow through when the world tried to move on. And she refused to move on. Not until accountability was real. Not until the city she loved confronted what had grown silently within its institutions. Laura watched Olivia with quiet admiration. "You're doing the right thing," she said gently. Olivia nodded but didn't answer right away. Her mind drifted back to memories she rarely revisited. Memories of being stopped on her walk home from school at 13, asked where she thought she was going. Memories of a store owner who once placed an empty shopping basket in her hands because, as he put it, people steal without meaning to. Memories of college seminars where professors praised her writing but questioned whether she understood the complexities of constitutional law. She understood them more deeply than they ever realized. Those early moments shaped her career. They shaped her voice in the courtroom. And now they shaped the lawsuit that would soon be the center of national attention. Meanwhile, Ethan spiraled, suspended, unemployed, and publicly condemned. He spent his days pacing through his small apartment, replaying every decision that led him to this point. He read the lawsuit 10 times, each page cutting deeper. The complaint cited the Fourth Amendment, unlawful search, wrongful detention, excessive force, emotional trauma, and more. It included statements from Marcus, from Supervisor Ramirez, from bystanders who had come forward after watching the viral video. Worst of all, It included early reports from Internal Affairs about his pattern of disproportionately stopping minority travelers. He had told himself for years that he was simply being vigilant, that he was following instinct, that he was upholding safety. But now, he saw those patterns laid out on paper like a mirror he had spent his life avoiding. And the reflection was ugly. Sarah filed for divorce 2 weeks after the lawsuit arrived. She couldn't raise a child in a home consumed by denial and fear. She couldn't stay married to someone who didn't recognize the harm he had caused. Ethan didn't fight her. He didn't have the strength. He watched her pack their child's clothes into a small suitcase, watched her load it into the car, watched the taillights disappear down the street. When the door closed behind her, the silence in the apartment felt heavy enough to crush him. He sat on the floor for a long time, staring at nothing, realizing that consequences always arrive slower than actions, but they land far harder. Olivia continued to build her case, piece by piece. She met with experts on police procedure, reviewed body cam policies, and documented the emotional impact of the incident. Her wrist, still healing from the injury caused by the cuffs, throbbed whenever she moved it too quickly. It was a small reminder of how fast things had escalated that day, how quickly dignity could be stripped by someone who didn't see what stood before him. She also met with a psychologist who encouraged her to include portions of her personal journal in the trial. The entries were raw, honest, and unfiltered. They revealed how deeply the incident had reopened wounds she thought had been closed. "The jury needs to see you as a full person," the psychologist said gently. "Not just a profession, not just a title, a person who carries history." Olivia took a long breath. Sharing those pages felt like exposing her ribs. But justice, she knew, often required vulnerability. Across the river, Ethan tried to drown his shame in alcohol. Nights blurred, days blurred more. He stopped answering calls from former colleagues. Most stopped calling after the first week anyway. The few who did try to reach him offered nothing but awkward silence and condolences that sounded more like relief that they weren't in his position. His old partner, Officer Dalton, left a voicemail that ended with a soft whisper, "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner." Ethan erased it, but the words lingered. He couldn't escape the truth anymore. The man he was at O'Hare wasn't a one-time lapse. It was the product of years of unchecked beliefs, inherited ideas, and pressure to live up to his father's legacy. Now that legacy felt like a weight tied to his ankles in early summer. The official notice arrived. The U.S. District Court had scheduled trial. Olivia sat quietly in her living room when she received the letter, letting the words settle. This wouldn't be a quick hearing. It wouldn't be a simple question of right or wrong. It would be a public confrontation, one that would require every ounce of strength she carried. She closed her eyes for a long moment, inhaled slowly, and placed her hand over her journal. This was the step where personal pain turned into public truth. Ethan received his notice on the same day. He held it with shaking hands, realizing that he would have to face Olivia in a courtroom, face the woman he had humiliated, face the truth he had spent weeks trying to understand. The fear inside him wasn't just fear of losing. It was fear of being seen. The battle lines had been drawn, and neither of them could turn away now. Court is in session. Judge Elena Vargas's gavel struck once, sharp and steady, echoing through the high-ceilinged courtroom with a firmness that quieted every whisper. The room settled into a stillness that felt almost sacred. Olivia Grant sat at the plaintiff's table beside Laura Chen, her posture calm, her hands folded gently, her injured wrist resting above the cuff of her blazer, across from her. Ethan Hayes took his seat at the defense table, shoulders hunched, eyes lowered, his suit slightly too large, as if he had shrunk inside it. The gallery was packed, journalists, legal observers, supporters from both sides, and strangers who had watched the viral video and felt compelled to witness the truth unfold. Even the air felt tense, like a held breath waiting to be released. Judge Vargas scanned the room with deliberate calm before speaking again. This case will be tried fairly, efficiently, and with respect from all parties. Her voice carried authority without aggression. She had presided over civil rights cases for decades, and she understood better than most that the law wasn't only about statutes. It was about people, pain, choices, consequences. Her presence offered balance, a steady hand guiding a turbulent ship. The first witness was Marcus Reed. He stepped forward with quiet confidence, knowing the weight of what he carried. His footage had ignited a national conversation as he took the stand. He adjusted the microphone slightly, his voice steady when he began. He described exactly what he saw at O'Hare, the tone Ethan used, the sudden escalation, Olivia's calm responses, and the tightening of the handcuffs. Vargas allowed the video to play for the jury, ensuring they saw every movement, every expression, every moment where authority crossed into abuse. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the image filled the screen. No commentary was needed. The footage spoke for itself. Some jurors shifted uncomfortably. Others watched with widened eyes. Ethan couldn't bring himself to look. Next came Supervisor Ramirez. He walked to the stand with the careful steps of a man who knew his words might shape the outcome. He testified about protocol, how officers assigned to airport duty were trained, what constituted reasonable suspicion, and where Ethan's actions deviated from the standards. His tone was respectful but firm. He didn't protect Ethan. He didn't condemn him. He reported the truth. When Laura asked whether Olivia had presented any sign of threat or legal justification for a search, Ramirez answered with a simple, quiet, no. The word hung in the air like a verdict of its own. As testimony continued, Olivia remained steady. She watched the proceedings with a controlled calm that came from years in courtrooms. Though this time, her heart beat differently. She wasn't representing a client. She was the client. She wasn't arguing on behalf of someone whose pain she carried in files and statements. She was carrying her own. And yet, she felt no desire for revenge, only purpose. Laura guided her gently through her testimony. Olivia spoke with clarity about the events, describing each moment without exaggeration. She explained the DOJ report that Ethan mistook for leaked material, the wrongful search, the language he used, the injury to her wrist, and the emotional weight of being treated as if she didn't belong. But the courtroom shifted when Laura introduced Olivia's personal journal entries as evidence. The pages were photocopied and bound, their handwriting still clear. Vargas allowed selected lines to be read aloud. Olivia spoke them in a voice that never wavered, even when the words revealed a younger version of herself, one who had been followed in stores, questioned by teachers, and dismissed by strangers who assumed she lacked belonging. The entries were raw but dignified. They revealed a lifetime of subtle and overt profiling. They showed the emotional toll of a life lived in two worlds, one shaped by achievement, the other shaped by suspicion. The jury leaned forward, absorbing each sentence. It wasn't just evidence, it was humanity. And humanity often carried more weight than statutes. The defense tried to counter with their own narrative. Ethan's attorney, an older man with a smooth voice and cautious charm, argued that Ethan had made a rookie mistake. He cited pressure, confusion, and the demands of airport patrol. He painted Ethan as overwhelmed and poorly trained. But Judge Vargas's expression remained composed, giving nothing away. When the attorney attempted to invoke qualified immunity, Vargas raised her hand. "Counsel," she said calmly, "qualified immunity does not apply to claims where constitutional violations are clearly established." Her tone was final, The argument ended there, when it came time for Ethan to testify. The courtroom shifted again. He walked slowly to the stand, looking far younger than 26, as though months of turmoil had peeled away the edges of his confidence. His voice shook when he began. He admitted that he had been nervous, eager to prove himself, and influenced by assumptions he never questioned. Then Laura asked the question everyone was waiting for. "Why did you stop Ms. Grant?" Ethan hesitated. His eyes lowered. The silence stretched. And then, with a voice barely above a whisper, he said the words that would define the trial. She didn't look like she belonged. The jury heard it. The gallery heard it. Olivia heard it. The room didn't erupt. It simply breathed. A long, heavy breath that felt like a truth finally spoken aloud. Laura said nothing for a moment. She didn't need to. Ethan's own admission had pierced the defense like a blade made of honesty and regret. When cross-examination ended, Ethan looked toward Olivia, not for forgiveness. He knew he hadn't earned that, but for acknowledgement. She didn't look away, but her expression remained steady, neither cruel nor comforting. She had learned long ago that justice was not the same as mercy. As the trial neared its close, the lawyers delivered their final arguments. Laura spoke about dignity, constitutional rights, and the importance of accountability. She didn't shout. She didn't dramatize. She spoke with clarity and conviction. Ethan's counsel emphasized remorse and inexperience, but the argument felt thin after Ethan's admission. When the jury finally retreated to deliberate, the courtroom exhaled in unison. Hours passed in slow, quiet tension. Olivia sat still, her hands folded, her breath measured. Ethan sat hunched, staring at a single spot on the table as though afraid to move. The door finally opened. The jury filed in. Their expressions were solemn, their steps deliberate. Every heartbeat in the room seemed to pause. The reckoning was moments away. Guilty. Judge Elena Vargas spoke the word with measured clarity, neither triumphant nor hesitant, but with the steady tone of someone delivering a truth that could no longer be denied. The courtroom absorbed the verdict in a single collective breath. Some people flinched, some closed their eyes, some simply stared straight ahead, letting the sound settle in their bones. Olivia Grant sat motionless at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped gently over her journal, her face calm but not untouched. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't celebrating. She simply listened, letting the weight of the moment pass through her like a slow, steady current. Across the aisle, Ethan Hayes sat with his head bowed, his shoulders sinking as though gravity itself had tightened around him. His lawyer placed a hand on his arm, but Ethan barely felt it. The verdict had arrived, and it carried consequences he had feared but still wasn't ready to face. Judge Vargas continued, her tone unwavering as she read the jury's findings. The evidence was clear. The unlawful stop, the baseless search, the excessive force, the injury to Olivia's wrist, the emotional harm, the pattern of bias supported by testimony, all of it crystallized into one unmistakable conclusion. Olivia's rights had been violated. The court awarded her $15 million in damages, an amount that reverberated through the room like a second gavel strike. Reporters shifted forward in their seats. Phones vibrated. Pens scratched across notepads. The ruling wasn't just a number. It was a message. It was the city being held accountable through its own courts. And it was the law stepping forward to say, with unmistakable force, that what happened at O'Hare mattered. Vargas then addressed the criminal charges under Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 242. Her voice softened slightly, though not with sympathy. Rather, with the gravity of what accountability required. Ethan stood when instructed, his hands trembling. The judge spoke of his actions, the violation of constitutional standards. And the impact on public trust? She acknowledged his remorse, his admission on the stand, his lack of prior violent misconduct. But remorse could not erase harm. She sentenced him to 2 years of probation, a $100,000 fine, and mandatory participation in a comprehensive bias reform program approved by the court. The sentence was not vindictive. It was corrective, designed not to destroy him, but to force him to confront the very roots of the choices he made. When the proceedings ended, the courtroom buzzed with restrained energy. Olivia remained seated for a moment, letting her breath settle, refusing to rush the emotion rising behind her ribs. Laura placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You did it," she whispered. But Olivia shook her head. "We did what needed to be done." She knew justice didn't erase pain, it acknowledged it. And sometimes, acknowledgement was the most powerful form of healing the law could offer. Outside the courthouse, cameras swarmed the steps, microphones angled forward, voices overlapped. But when Olivia emerged, a hush fell through the crowd. She stood before the press in the warm afternoon light, her posture steady, her presence calm. "This case was never just about me," she said. "It was about fairness. It was about accountability. And it was about every person who has been made to feel out of place in a space where they belong." Her voice did not rise. It didn't need to. The sincerity carried farther than volume ever could. She spoke of national reform, of training that went beyond lectures and checked boxes, of the need for empathy in policing, and of the quiet persistence required to change a system from within. When she finished, reporters shouted questions, but she offered only one final sentence before stepping away. "Justice is the first step. Now comes the work," while the city reacted. Ethan drifted through the aftermath like a man wandering through smoke. His job was gone, his badge surrendered, his name splashed across headlines he no longer had the courage to read. His apartment felt smaller each day. His phone buzzed with calls he didn't return. The divorce papers had been finalized. Sarah had moved to her sister's house, taking their child with her. When Ethan visited to drop off supplies one afternoon, he stood on the porch listening to faint laughter from inside, a sound he once found comforting but now felt cut off from, as if he stood behind a glass wall he had built with his own hands. Sarah met him at the door with a firm, polite expression, not angry, not cruel, but resolute. "You need to get help," she said softly, "for yourself and for him." She didn't close the door abruptly. She closed it slowly, giving him space to step back. But the click of the latch still echoed like a judgment. Nights grew longer. He sat in a worn motel room on the edge of the city, the air thick with silence and stale carpet. One night, the weight became unbearable. He sat on the bed with a pill bottle beside him, staring at the label, his thoughts drifting into shadows he had never allowed himself to enter. The room felt suffocating. His pulse hammered, his hands shook. Then, without fully understanding why, he picked up his phone instead. He called the only crisis line he could find in a shaky search. A calm voice answered, and for the first time since O'Hare. Ethan spoke honestly, about his upbringing, the pressure to follow his father's path, the shame he carried, and the fear of what he had become. The conversation didn't solve everything, but it stopped him. It pulled him back to breath, back to consequence, back to possibility. Weeks later, he entered the first session of his court-mandated bias reform program. The room was filled with people from different backgrounds, psychologists, former officers, community leaders. He took a seat in the back, unsure of his place, but the facilitator began with a sentence that stayed with him. "Accountability is painful, but it's the first step toward change. You're here because change is still possible." Ethan didn't believe it that day, but he stayed. And the next week, he stayed again, slowly. The truth he had denied became the truth he accepted, and acceptance became the ground on which he began to rebuild. Meanwhile, Olivia returned to work with a renewed sense of purpose. Her injury healed. Her voice carried even more weight in the DOJ. She met with federal officials to discuss training reforms grounded in lived experience and emotional intelligence. She gave interviews that emphasized solutions rather than anger. She mentored younger attorneys who had watched the trial unfold and now looked to her for guidance. She didn't claim victory. She carried responsibility. When evening came, she walked through her quiet apartment, pausing by her journal on the table. She placed her hand on it gently. The pages inside held pain, truth, memory, and the steps that carried her from humiliation to courtroom justice. She understood now that her story wasn't just her own, and that its impact would ripple far beyond the trial, across the city. Ethan sat in a folding chair in a small community center, listening to a speaker discuss implicit bias with grace instead of condemnation. He didn't know where his life was going yet, but for the first time, he wasn't turning away from the road ahead. He was facing it, even if he walked it alone. The reckoning had been delivered. Now, the legacy would begin. Olivia Grant stood at the center of the packed conference hall, the microphone steady in her hand as hundreds of attorneys, advocates, and law students looked up at her with a mixture of admiration and reverence. The quiet hum of anticipation settled over the room like a soft blanket. She took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the moment, the warmth of the lights, and the unmistakable truth that her life had shifted in ways she had never imagined the day Officer Ethan Hayes stopped her in the VIP line at O'Hare. Now she stood here not as a victim, but as a teacher, someone whose personal pain had carved a path for national change. Justice, she said, her voice calm and steady, does not begin in a courtroom. It begins in the small choices we make when no one is watching. Her words carried across the hall, landing gently, with a quiet force that lingered in the air long after she paused. The applause that followed wasn't loud or explosive. It was warm, steady, grateful. People weren't clapping for spectacle. They were clapping for truth. Over the past months, Olivia had become a national figure, not because she sought attention, but because her story exposed the cracks in systems familiar to millions. Chicago had already begun implementing the mandatory bias training reforms Judge Vargas ordered, and other cities were now studying the program, eager to replicate it. Olivia had been called to testify before committees, advise federal task forces, and speak to law schools about constitutional safeguards and the quiet courage required to enforce them. Reporters followed her, but she refused sensationalism. She chose clarity instead. She chose dignity. She chose to tell stories that reminded people the law was not an abstract idea. It lived in everyday encounters, in how people were treated, in how power was used or misused, behind her rise. One project had taken on a life of its own, the publication of her journal. At first, she resisted the idea. The entries were private, handwritten in vulnerable moments, never meant for public eyes. But editors encouraged her to consider what her words might offer to others who had walked similar paths. She eventually agreed on one condition: that the tone remain authentic, unpolished, and honest. The book was released in early autumn under the title Belonging, Reflections on Justice and Memory. The response was immediate. People didn't just read her entries. They felt them. They saw their own experiences reflected in the quiet confessions, in the stories of discrimination she carried from childhood, in the determination that guided her career. Schools added the book to their civil rights curriculum. Community groups used it for discussion sessions, and young women, especially those of color, wrote letters saying that her words made them feel seen for the first time. while Olivia's influence continued expanding. Another story unfolded in quieter rooms across the city. Ethan Hayes walked into a small classroom at the West Ridge Community Center, carrying a worn notebook and a shy, uncertain expression. The room held a dozen teenagers, some skeptical, some curious, all waiting to hear from a man whose name had been splashed across headlines only months before. He cleared his throat, steadying himself. "I made a mistake," he said simply. "A serious mistake. And I'm here to talk to you about how it happened and what it took to face it." He didn't soften the details. He didn't shift blame. He spoke about his upbringing, the pressure to live up to his father's reputation, the blind spots he hadn't examined, and the moment he realized that bias wasn't always loud. It could be quiet, subtle, unrecognized, but still harmful. The teens listened, not with admiration, but with interest. They asked questions. They challenged him. They pushed him to confront the deeper layers of his choices. And he stayed, week after week. Word spread. Other community centers invited him to speak. His life wasn't repaired. His marriage wasn't restored. His career in policing was over, but he was no longer drowning. He was learning how to build a different kind of service. The quiet turning point came months later. At a national policy conference in Washington, Olivia had been invited as the keynote speaker. But before she took the stage, a panel on bias reform programs was held in a smaller auditorium. Ethan sat in the audience, listening to experts present new models for police accountability. He wasn't on the panel. He didn't expect to be, but at the end, during open discussion, someone asked whether people who caused harm could ever become part of the solution. A moderator scanned the room, looking for voices, and slowly, almost reluctantly, Ethan raised his hand. He spoke with humility, without seeking praise or absolution. He described his path, the fall, the reckoning, the long months of introspection and repair. The room listened, not approving, not condemning, simply listening. When he finished, the moderator thanked him for speaking. Ethan nodded and took his seat, heart pounding but lighter than it had felt in years, when the keynote session began. Ethan stayed in his seat at the back, unsure if Olivia even knew he was there. She walked onto the stage, poised and calm, wearing the quiet confidence that had grown stronger with each passing month. Her speech was direct, thoughtful, and deeply human. She spoke of dignity, empathy, and the urgent need for fairness in the moments when authority feels easiest to abuse. And then, near the end, she paused and scanned the room. Her eyes stopped, for just a moment, on Ethan. It wasn't a gesture of forgiveness. It wasn't an invitation to forget. It was simply acknowledgement, a recognition that change, while imperfect, was possible. Ethan lowered his gaze, feeling something like relief settle quietly in his chest as the year drew to a close. Olivia returned home to the city that shaped her. She visited law schools, spoke at community events, and mentored young attorneys determined to follow paths similar to hers. She didn't see herself as a hero. She saw herself as a steward of responsibility. The lawsuit had brought accountability. The verdict had brought reform. But the true legacy, she believed, would come from the people who carried the lessons forward: future advocates, young leaders, thoughtful officers, and anyone willing to confront uncomfortable truths with honesty instead of defensiveness. One evening, she sat on her balcony overlooking the Chicago skyline, her journal resting on her lap, the cool night breeze brushing her shoulders. She opened to a fresh page and began writing, not about pain this time, and not about conflict. She wrote about growth, about resilience, about the long path from humiliation to hope. And as she wrote, She understood that justice wasn't a moment. It was a journey, a difficult, necessary, and ongoing journey across the city. Ethan prepared for another community workshop, carrying a binder marked with notes and reflections. He wasn't the same man who stopped Olivia at the airport. He wasn't free of mistakes, but he was learning. He was trying. And he was determined to ensure that others learned from his failure. Justice had done its work. Now, change, quiet, steady, human change, would carry the story forward. Thank you so much for watching this story. I appreciate your time and your support. Before you go, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. It helps the channel grow and brings more stories just like this one.